Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, find a comfortable spot, and just settle in. Tonight, we're going to spend about 90 minutes drifting through the cold, drafty, and occasionally very bizarre world of a medieval Christmas. It wasn't exactly Hallmark movies and hot cocoa. It was more like salted fish, legal loopholes for drinking, and a startling amount of mud. So let's just take a deep breath, leave the modern world behind, and float back to a time when a white Christmas usually just meant your roof was leaking snow onto your bed of straw. To understand the medieval Christmas, we first have to understand that these people were absolutely obsessed with the number 12, because of course they were. Why celebrate for one day when you can drag it out for nearly 2 weeks of mandatory relaxation that was actually just a series of very specific social obligations? The 12 Days of Christmas wasn't just a song about birds. It was a grueling marathon of eating, drinking, and trying not to offend your local lord. Let's start on the morning of December 25th. You're a peasant. Your house smells like wood smoke and damp wool. You wake up, and for the first time in months, you don't have to go into the fields. This is the great irony of the medieval winter. Everyone was technically resting, but only because the ground was as hard as a brick and there was literally nothing else to do. The first thing you do is head to church. Now, this wasn't one service, it was 3. One at midnight, one at dawn, and one in the middle of the morning. Because if you weren't tired enough from the freezing cold, nothing says holiday spirit like standing on a stone floor for 4 hours while a man in a robe chants in a language you don't actually speak. But hey, it was warmish because of all the bodies packed in there, and the incense probably covered up the fact that nobody had showered since September. Once the spiritual part was out of the way, the real chaos began. This was the time of the Lord of Misrule. In every village and every great hall, they'd pick some random person, usually a low-ranking servant or a particularly unimposing peasant, and declare them the king of the festivities. Because nothing is more relaxing than giving a guy who usually shovels manure the power to tell the local earl what to do for 12 days. It was a pressure valve, really, a way to let everyone blow off steam so they didn't, burn the manor house down in July. Speaking of the manor house, if you were a tenant, this was the day you'd head up to the big house. But you didn't go empty-handed. You had to bring a gift to your lord. Usually it was something like a couple of hens or a pile of grain. And in return, the lord would give you a feast. It was a very awkward, very structured trade. Here is a chicken I can barely afford to give you, you'd say, and the lord would reply, "Thank you, peasant. Please come inside and eat some beef that's slightly past its prime while I sit at a table 3 feet higher than yours." The food was interesting. If you were rich, you were aiming for the boar's head. This was the ultimate status symbol. They'd bring out a literal pig's head, often stuffed with more meat and decorated with rosemary. It looked like the pig was having a very bad day, but to a medieval person, this was the height of luxury. If you weren't rich, you were probably eating frumenty. It's essentially a thick, savory porridge made of cracked wheat, boiled in milk and seasoned with cinnamon and saffron if you were feeling fancy. It has the consistency of wet cement, but it's warm, and when it's 10 degrees outside, warm is a flavor. Then there was the drinking. Oh, the drinking. Ale was the primary source of calories for most of the winter. They had something called lamb's wool, which sounds soft but was actually just hot ale mixed with sugar, spices, and roasted apples that would pop and look like white wool. It was basically a medieval smoothie that also happened to get you very, very tipsy. As the afternoon light faded, which, let's be honest, happened at about 3 p.m., the real weirdness started. Have you ever heard of mumming? It was basically the medieval version of a home invasion, but with costumes. People would dress up in masks or swap clothes, so the men were in dresses and the women were in tunics, and they'd go from house to house. They wouldn't speak, they'd just dance, play dice, and demand food. If a group of silent, masked neighbors showed up at your door in the middle of the night, you didn't call the authorities, you gave them a pie, because that's just how Christmas worked. And we can't forget the greenery. While they didn't have the modern Christmas tree, that's a much later German invention, they were obsessed with holly and ivy. They believed these plants had special powers because they stayed green when everything else died. They decked the halls, literally, to keep the evil spirits away, or maybe just to hide the fact that the walls were made of dirt and straw. As the night of the 25th wore on, the fires would roar in the great halls. The Yule log was a massive chunk of wood that had to be kept burning for the full 12 days. If it went out, it was considered a sign of catastrophic bad luck. So someone, usually the youngest servant, had the very stressful job of making sure a piece of wood stayed on fire for 2 weeks straight. It was a time of strange contradictions. It was the holiest time of the year, yet it was the most lawless. It was a time of charity, but also a time where the social hierarchy was reinforced through very specific, very awkward rituals. Everyone was cold, everyone was a little bit drunk, and everyone was just trying to make it through to January without getting the plague or running out of firewood. So, as we drift through these 12 days of history, just imagine the flickering candlelight, the smell of roasting boar, and the sound of a lute playing slightly out of tune. It's a quiet, heavy kind of peace, a medieval winter peace. Royal disasters and the 12 days of gloom. So, we've made it through the initial shock of Christmas Day. The boar's head has been picked clean, the lamb's wool ale has left everyone with a mild, throbbing headache, and the Yule log is crackling away in the hearth. But in the medieval world, the party, if you can call it that, was only just beginning. We have 11 more days to get through, and frankly, this is where things start to get a little bit messy, especially when you involve the royals. Because if there's one thing a medieval king loved more than a crown, it was a Christmas spent being incredibly dramatic, while everyone around them tried to stay warm. Let's talk about the Plantagenet. Specifically, let's look at Henry II. Now, Henry was a man who didn't really do relaxing. His idea of a holiday was pacing around a drafty stone room while yelling about his sons. In 1170, the very year of our story's backdrop, Christmas was particularly tense. You see, Henry had a bit of a friendship problem with a man named Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. While the rest of England was trying to figure out which end of the holly branch was the least prickly, Henry was spending his Christmas in France, absolutely fuming. Imagine the scene, a massive stone hall in Bures, Normandy. It's freezing. The tapestries are fluttering because 12th century windows were basically just holes with ideas of grandeur. Henry is sitting there, probably picking at a piece of salted venison, and he's just spiraling. This is the classic royal Christmas meltdown. He's surrounded by his knights, who are all probably wishing they were back home opening their own mediocre gifts. Instead, they have to watch the king have a tantrum. It was during this specific festive season, just a few days after Christmas, that Henry allegedly uttered those famous, frustrated words, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Now, in a modern setting, that's just a boss venting during a bad holiday shift. But in 1170, your boss is a king who claims to be chosen by God. 4 of his knights, likely fueled by too much Christmas wine and a desire to be the ultimate teacher's pets, took him literally. They slipped out of the festivities, crossed the English Channel in the dead of winter, which, by the way, sounds like a nightmare, and murdered Becket in his own cathedral on December 29th. So, if you think your family Christmas dinner was awkward because your uncle brought up politics, just remember that in 1170, the royal Christmas gift was a literal martyred archbishop. Talk about a mood killer for the remaining 8 days of the feast. But let's float away from the blood-stained altars and back to the general weirdness of the 12 days.
After Christmas Day comes December 26th, St. Stephen's Day. For the medieval peasant, this was the day of the horses. They believed that bleeding your horses on this day would keep them healthy for the year. Yes, the day after the Savior's birth, the plan was to take the farm equipment to the vet for a literal bloodletting. It's that lovely medieval blend of piety, and we have no idea how biology works, so let's try something rhythmic. Then we hit December 28th, Holy Innocents' Day, or Childermas. This was 100% the gloomiest day of the year. It commemorated the children killed by Herod, and for a medieval person, it was considered the unluckiest day on the calendar. You didn't start a project, you didn't get married, and you certainly didn't travel. In some parts of Europe, parents would even wake their children up by gently whipping them, just to remind them of the suffering of the innocents. Because nothing says happy holidays than a morning wake-up call of mild physical penance. It's a bit of a buzzkill, isn't it? Just sliding from a feast into a day where everyone is terrified of doing anything productive. As we move into the new year, we have to talk about the Feast of Fools. This usually happened around January 1st. If the Lord of Misrule was a local village thing, the Feast of Fools was the church's version of letting their hair down, and it was chaotic. Subdeacons and lower clergy would basically take over the cathedral. They'd wear masks, dress as women or minstrels, and sing wanton songs. They'd even eat sausages at the altar while the priest was trying to say Mass. It was the one day of the year when the very rigid, very scary Catholic Church decided to act like a frat house. The upper halves obviously hated it, but the tradition was so popular they couldn't stop it for centuries. It was a necessary release. When your entire life is defined by the fear of eternal damnation and the whims of a Lord who might have you executed for looking at a deer the wrong way, you really need a day to eat a sausage in a church while wearing a dress. By the time we reached the end of the 12 days, January 5th or 12th night, everyone was exhausted. This was the grand finale. This was when the 12th cake was brought out. Deep inside this dense, fruit-filled cake was a single dried bean and a pea. If you found the bean in your slice, you were the king of the night. If you found the pea, you were the queen. It didn't matter if you were a kitchen scullery maid or a high-born knight. For one night, the bean decided your fate. You got to lead the songs, choose the dances, and generally be the center of attention. It's a very sweet, very simple way to end the season. A little bit of luck in a world that was usually quite cruel. But then the sun rises on January 7th, Plow Monday. The holiday is over. The decorations, the holly and the ivy, have to be taken down and burned or you'll have bad luck. The mud is still there, the cold is even worse, and now you have to go back to the fields and start prepping the frozen ground for the spring. The transition from the Lord of Misrule back to the guy who pays rent to a man who just murdered an archbishop was probably a pretty rough morning Monday. The medieval Christmas wasn't a cozy escape. It was a brief, brightly lit pause in a very dark room. It was a time when the world was turned upside down, where peasants were kings and priests were fools, all held together by the thin hope that the sun would eventually stay up a little longer. As you settle deeper into your blankets, just think about those flickering torches in the drafty halls. Think about the silence of the snow over the fields and the distant sound of a mummer laughing in the dark. The world was smaller then and much stranger.
Winter remedies and royal nursery nightmares. So, we've survived the 12th night. The bean has been found, the Lord of Misrule has handed back his wooden scepter, and the Yule log is nothing more than a pile of white ash in the grate. But now we enter the truly grueling part of the medieval winter, the long, dark stretch of January and February. This was the time when festive cheer was replaced by trying not to catch a cold that might actually end your family line. If you were a royal in the 14th century, this was a particularly terrifying time, because while you had the best tapestries and the thickest fur cloaks, your medical care was,
Well, let's just say it was less science and more hopeful guesswork involving garden herbs and astrological charts. Let's imagine a royal nursery in the mid-1300s. It's a stone room, likely draped in heavy wool to stop the drafts, but the damp still creeps in. You have a young prince. Let's call him Edward, because let's face it, they were almost all named Edward. He has a cough. In 2026, you'd give him some syrup and a nap. In 1340, this was a national crisis. The royal physicians would be summoned, and these were men who spent more time looking at the moon than at the patient. The first thing they'd check wasn't the boy's temperature, but his humors. You see, medieval medicine was based on the idea that the body was a delicate balance of four liquids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Winter was considered the season of phlegm, cold and moist. So obviously, if the little prince was sick, he had too much cold in him. The solution? Hot remedies. And I don't mean spicy soup. I mean things like rubbing his chest with goose grease mixed with pepper, or making him drink wine infused with crushed pearls, because apparently, if it's expensive, the body thinks it's more effective. If the cough persisted, things got weirder. One popular remedy for respiratory issues involved dried frogs, or if you were feeling particularly adventurous, the breath of a donkey. There was a genuine belief that if a child breathed in the air of a stable, the strength of the animals would somehow transfer to them. So picture a tiny, shivering royal heir being carried out to a freezing barn at 3 a.m. because a man in a pointed hat said the stars aligned over the hay bales. It's a wonder anyone survived childhood at all, honestly. But the real drama of the winter nursery was the spoiled royal factor. These children were raised with the knowledge that they were literally better than everyone else, but they were also incredibly fragile. Take the children of King Edward III. He had a lot of them, and he spent a fortune on their winter wardrobes. We're talking robes lined with ermine and miniver, the white belly fur of squirrels. Hundreds of squirrels died so a 5-year-old prince could stay warm while pouting about his porridge. Yet despite the furs, the palaces were breeding grounds for what they called the gout or the ague. The hygiene, or lack thereof, didn't help. There was a common misconception that bathing in winter was dangerous because it opened the pores to pestilential air. So the most powerful people in the world would go months without a full scrub, relying instead on rose water to mask the scent of 4 layers of unwashed wool. Imagine the nursery, the smell of expensive incense, damp dogs, unwashed royalty, and the faint, lingering aroma of that goose grease treatment. It's a miracle the divine right of kings wasn't debunked simply by the smell of the throne room in February. And let's talk about the emotional meltdowns. Medieval royals were notoriously high-strung. When you're told from birth that you're God's representative on earth, but you're currently shivering and have a toothache that no amount of prayer is fixing, you tend to get a bit difficult. We see records of royal children throwing princely tantrums, where they would smash expensive pottery or refuse to eat anything but sugared almonds for a week. The tutors and nannies had to navigate this carefully. You couldn't exactly put a future king in time out without risking a stay in the dungeon yourself. As the winter deepened, the focus shifted to the great hunger. Even for the wealthy, fresh food ran out. They were living on salted meats, meat that had been sitting in barrels of brine since November. It was tough, it was incredibly salty, and it led to all sorts of digestive disasters that the physicians would then try to treat with even more bizarre concoctions, like powdered unicorn horn, which was actually just ground-up narwhal tusk, but don't tell them that. There's a certain irony in it all. These kings and queens lived in massive, imposing castles built to withstand sieges and armies, yet they were constantly defeated by a common draft or a piece of bad fish. They had all the power in the world, but they were at the mercy of a winter fever that didn't care about their lineage. So, as you tuck yourself in tonight, Be grateful for modern medicine and central heating. Imagine the flickering candle in that cold stone nursery, the sound of the wind howling against the battlements, and the little Prince Edward, covered in squirrel fur and goose grease, waiting for the spring that feels like it's 1,000 years away. The medieval world was a place of grand titles and very small, very cold realities. The night is long, the fire is low, and the history is just drifting by. Let the image of the drafty castle fade away, replaced by the warmth of your own bed. The princes and kings are long gone, their tantrums forgotten, their furs turned to dust. All that's left is the quiet, steady rhythm of a winter night.
Dark folklore and the shadows in the snow. So, we've made it through the royal nurseries and the questionable medical advice of the 14th century. But as the winter wind continues to howl outside those thick stone walls, we have to look at what was happening in the minds of the people sitting around the fire. You see, for a medieval person, the darkness of January wasn't just an absence of light, it was a presence. It was a thick, heavy blanket that hid things that didn't particularly care for human company. When the sun went down at 4 in the afternoon and didn't show its face again for 16 hours, your imagination started to do some very heavy lifting. Let's lean into the shadows for a moment. This is the era of folklore that wasn't cute. There were no friendly snowmen or reindeer with glowing noses. Instead, there was the wild hunt. Imagine you're a peasant walking back to your cottage. The moon is a thin sliver, and the trees are skeletal hands reaching for the sky. Suddenly, you hear the sound of baying hounds and the thunder of hooves in the air above you. This wasn't a physical army, it was a spectral one. Led by a figure like Odin or the mythical king Herla, the wild hunt was a procession of the restless dead, sweeping across the winter sky to claim the souls of the unwary. If you heard them coming, you didn't look up. You dropped to the ground and pressed your face into the freezing mud, because seeing them meant you were likely to be invited along, and that was a one-way trip. The wild hunt was the medieval way of explaining that terrifying, lonely feeling of a winter gale. It turned the wind into a narrative. It made the chaos of nature feel personal. Because, of course, a medieval person would rather believe in a terrifying ghost army than accept that the weather is just indifferent to their existence. But it wasn't just the sky you had to worry about, it was the Perchta. In the Alpine regions and throughout parts of Germanic Europe, Perchta was a goddess who wandered the earth during the 12 days of Christmas. She had two forms, a beautiful woman as white as snow, or a jagged, terrifying hag with one foot that was unnaturally large, sometimes called a goose foot. She was the enforcer of social order. If she found a household where the women hadn't finished spinning all their wool by the end of the year, or if the house was messy, her punishments were, well, let's just say they involved a lot of internal organ redistribution and straw. It's a very vivid way to ensure everyone keeps up with their chores during the holidays, isn't it? Clean the kitchen, or the winter hag will replace your stomach with pebbles. It certainly puts a modern to-do list into perspective. Then we have the Krampus, though back then he was less of a pop culture icon and more of a genuine nightmare. He was the shadow to St. Nicholas. While the saint gave out treats, Krampus, this hairy, horned beast with chains and a bundle of birch sticks, was there to deal with the problematic children. In the medieval mind, there was a very thin line between a holiday and a horror story. Everything had a price. You couldn't have the light of the feast without acknowledging the darkness of the woods. And speaking of the woods, let's talk about the Belsnickel. He was a bit more grounded, but no less unsettling. He would show up at your door dressed in tattered furs and masks, smelling of the forest, and carrying a switch.
He'd throw nuts and candies on the floor, and if the children scrambled to pick them up too greedily, he'd give them a sharp tap with his stick. It was a constant lesson in restraint. Even in the middle of a celebration, you were being watched, you were being judged. The medieval winter was a season of surveillance by the supernatural. Why were they so obsessed with these monsters? Because the winter was a time of death. Plants died, animals were slaughtered because there wasn't enough fodder to keep them all alive, and old people often didn't see the spring. These myths were a way to process that. If you could give the cold a face, even a terrifying one, it was easier to handle than the raw, empty silence of a frozen field. Inside the great halls, the nobility tried to laugh these things off with mummers' plays. They'd dress up as dragons or devils and perform short, silly skits. But even then, the costumes were made of animal skins and carved wood. By the flickering light of a dying fire, a man in a deer skull mask doesn't look like an actor. He looks like a memory of something ancient. The snarky royal commentary would likely involve the king making fun of a knight's terrible acting, while secretly clutching his lucky amulet a little tighter as the shadows danced on the stone walls. As the night deepens, let's imagine the village at rest. The fires have burned down to glowing embers. Every creak of the timber, every rustle of the thatch is interpreted through this lens of folklore. Is that the wind, or is it Perchta checking the spinning wheels? Is that a wolf in the distance, or is it a hound of the wild hunt? This was the psychological landscape of the medieval world, a world where the line between the physical and the spiritual was as thin as a layer of frost on a window pane. It's a strange, heavy kind of comfort, knowing that people have been staring into the dark and seeing monsters for 1,000 years. It makes our own modern worries feel a bit more manageable. We don't have to worry about a goose-footed hag checking our laundry. We just have to worry about the Wi-Fi going out. So let your mind drift away from the chains of the Krampus and the hooves of the spectral horses. Let the wild hunt fly far away over the horizon. You are safe, you are warm, and the monsters of the medieval winter are nothing more than stories told to pass the time until the sun returns. The shadows are just shadows, the wind is just air, and the history is just a long, slow river carrying us toward the morning.
Divination, onions, and the anxiety of the new year. So, we've made it past the monsters in the woods and the spectral hounds in the sky. We are now standing at the threshold of the new year. But for the medieval mind, January 1st wasn't just about making resolutions you'd break by the 3rd. It was a high-stakes gambling match with fate. You see, when life expectancy is roughly the age of a modern graduate student and your entire food supply depends on whether or not it rains in April, you get very, very interested in the future. And since they didn't have weather satellites or economic forecasts, they turned to the only thing they had: onions, buckets of water, and the unintentional comedy of bird watching. Let's settle back into that drafty manor house. It's the eve of the new year. The Lord of Misrule is likely passed out in a corner, and the king is probably nursing a headache from all that spiced wine. But in the kitchens and the cottages, the real science is happening. This was the night for Hogmanay traditions and first footing. The belief was simple. The first person to cross your threshold after midnight determined your luck for the next 365 days. If a tall, dark-haired man walked in carrying a piece of coal, you were golden. Fire, warmth, and prosperity were coming your way. But if a fair-haired person, or heaven forbid, a woman walked in first, well, you might as well just pack it in. Your crops would fail, your cow would stop giving milk, and you'd probably stub your toe every day for a year. It's that lovely medieval logic where the fate of an entire village rests on the hair color of the first guy who gets thirsty after midnight. You can almost hear the snarky comments from the local priest. "Oh great, it's Blaine with the ginger beard. I guess we're eating grass this summer." But if you really wanted to get specific about the future, you used onions. This is one of my favorite bits of medieval nonsense. It was called onion divination. You would take 12 onions, one for each month of the year, and hollow out the tops. You'd put a pinch of salt in each one and leave them on the windowsill overnight. In the morning, you'd check them. If the salt in the January onion was wet, it meant a rainy month. If the August onion was dry, you were looking at a drought. It was basically a vegetable-based weather app. And the best part? People actually made massive financial and agricultural decisions based on how much a root vegetable had sweated in the dark. For the royals, the New Year was a bit more performative. This was the day of New Year's gifts. Unlike Christmas, which was more about the feast, the New Year was when you gave literal stuff to the king to prove you weren't planning a rebellion. We have records from the court of Henry VI and later monarchs showing lists of gifts that were frankly ridiculous. Nobles would gift the king gold cups, embroidered shirts, or even exotic animals. In return, the king would give them silver plate. It was a massive, expensive game of I like you more than you like me. But behind the gold and the silver, there was a deep underlying anxiety. The New Year was when the prognostications were read. These were popular manuscripts that predicted the future based on which day of the week Christmas had fallen. If Christmas was on a Sunday, it meant a good winter but a windy summer. If it was on a Thursday, that meant death of kings. You can imagine the atmosphere in the palace when the court astrologer cleared his throat and announced, "So, Christmas was on a Thursday, sire. Maybe don't stand near any sharp objects or disgruntled dukes this year." The medieval person lived in a world of signs. Nothing was a coincidence. If a crow landed on your left side while you were walking to the New Year's Mass, that was a bad omen. If you sneezed while looking at the moon, you were in trouble. They were constantly scanning the world for a glitch in the matrix that would tell them what was coming. It's a very exhausting way to live, always looking for a hidden meaning in the way a log burns or the pattern of frost on a bucket of water. And then there was the calends. This was an old Roman tradition that survived deep into the Middle Ages. People would dress up as animals, specifically calves or deer, and run through the streets. The church absolutely hated this. They called it filthy and pagan, but people kept doing it because, let's be honest, if you've been stuck in a cold house for 3 weeks, putting on a cow mask and shouting at your neighbors sounds like a great way to blow off steam. It was a way to scare away the old year and welcome the new one with enough noise that the death of kings wouldn't hear you. As the first week of January crept forward, the focus shifted to the St. Agnes Eve and other minor feasts, where young women would perform rituals to see their future husbands. They would fast or put sprigs of rosemary under their pillows, hoping to dream of the man they would marry. In a world where marriage was your only form of social security, this wasn't just a cute game, it was a desperate search for a retirement plan. So, as we watch the candles flicker low in our imaginary 14th century hall, think about that tension. The new year wasn't a clean slate, it was a mystery box. You had your salt-filled onions on the sill, your piece of coal by the door, and a very nervous king checking his astrological charts. Everyone was just trying to buy a little bit of certainty in a world that felt incredibly random. The air in the hall is thick with the smell of extinguished candles and stale ale. The excitement of the Lord of Misrule has faded into the quiet, steady anxiety of survival. But there's a peace in it too. The rituals gave them something to do. They gave the darkness a structure. Let your own worries about the future drift away. You don't need to check the salt in an onion to know you're safe and warm right now. The death of kings is a problem for a different century. For you, the new year is just a quiet room, a soft pillow, and the slow, rhythmic breathing of the world at rest. The future will get here when it gets here. For now, there's just the shadows, the silence, and the long, slow drift toward sleep.
The frozen Thames and the ice-bound kingdom. So we've navigated the onion-scented anxieties of the new year and the terrifying hags of the high mountains. Now let's drift into a very specific, very strange chapter of medieval history. Imagine a winter so profound, so bone-chillingly deep that the very arteries of the kingdom, the great rivers, simply stopped moving. We're floating toward the year 1408. This wasn't just a chilly season, this was the Great Winter. It was a time when the world turned into a silent white wasteland, and for the people of London, it meant that the River Thames became something it was never meant to be, a solid, limestone-hard road of ice. Now, if you're a king like Henry IV, a frozen river is a bit of a logistical nightmare. Your boats can't move, your supplies are stuck, and your palace at Westminster is suddenly a lot more accessible to anyone who can walk on water. But for the average person, a frozen river was an invitation to a very weird kind of party. Because, as we've established, if medieval people were anything, they were opportunistic. If life gives you a frozen river, you don't just stay inside and shiver, you build a city on top of it. Picture the Thames in 1408. The ice was so thick that you could lead a team of oxen across it without hearing so much as a crack. It stayed frozen for 14 weeks. Think about that for a second. That is 3.5 months of solid ice. In our modern world, we panic if the sidewalk is slippery for 2 days. In 1400s London, they just looked at the river and said, well, I guess that's where the market is now. They called them frost fairs. People would set up tents and booths directly on the ice. There were barbers, tailors, and of course, a staggering number of temporary pubs. Because if there's one thing a Londoner needs when standing on 20 feet of ice, it's a pint of lukewarm ale. They would even light fires on the ice to roast meat. Imagine the physics of that. Sitting around a roaring fire, eating a sausage, while knowing there's a deep freezing river just a few feet beneath your boots. It's that perfect medieval blend of why not and this is definitely going to end badly. But it wasn't just about shopping and drinking. The 1408 winter brought out a very specific kind of dark, icy humor. They held sports on the river. They would tie animal bones to their feet, the original ice skates, and use poles to propel themselves across the surface. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't Olympic, it was mostly a lot of grown men in wool tunics falling over and sliding into each other while a crowd of people cheered from the banks. In the royal court, however, the mood was a bit more somber. Henry IV was not having a good time. He was already sickly, and the extreme cold was doing him no favors. The snarky whispers in the hallways of the palace were that the king's skin was turning as pale and flaky as the frost on the windows. The physicians were panicking, probably trying to prescribe him warm foods like ginger and cinnamon, or perhaps rubbing his feet with heated bricks. But no matter how many furs you draped over a king, a stone castle in a 14-week freeze is basically just a very fancy walk-in freezer. The Great Winter also had a devastating effect on the wildlife. Records tell us that the birds were so frozen they would simply drop out of the trees mid-flight. In the countryside, the deer were so desperate for food they would wander into the villages and stand there staring at the humans with a sort of pathetic, icy resignation. For the peasants, this was a tragedy, but also a buffet. If a frozen deer falls in your yard, that's a gift from God that bypasses the local lord's hunting laws. As the weeks dragged on into February, the novelty of the frost fair started to wear off. The wood supplies were running dangerously low. In a world where your only heat source is a fireplace, running out of wood is a death sentence. People started breaking down old fences, then sheds, then furniture. There's a quiet, desperate rhythm to that kind of cold. The world becomes very small, just the distance between you and the hearth. The social hierarchy, as always, stayed weird. While the poor were burning their stools to stay warm, the nobility were still trying to maintain appearances. They would host ice banquets, where the food would arrive at the table already cold, and the wine would have to be chipped out of the decanter. It was a miserable, frozen theater of status. You can almost hear a duchess complaining that her peacock pie is a bit crunchy because the gravy has turned into a popsicle. And then there was the fear of the thaw. As much as they hated the cold, they were terrified of what would happen when the ice finally broke. When the Thames eventually started to melt, it didn't do so gently. Massive chunks of ice, the size of houses, would break off and barrel down the river, smashing into the piers of London Bridge. The bridge back then had houses and shops built on it, so you'd be sleeping in your bed and suddenly hear a sound like a cannon blast as a ton of ice slammed into the stone foundations of your home. But for now, in our story, we are still in the deep freeze. The world is silent. The frost fair is in full swing. Somewhere on the ice, a man is selling hot gingerbread that is probably room temperature at best. A group of boys are sliding on bone skates, their laughter muffled by the heavy, freezing air. The king is staring out of a frosted window at Westminster, wondering if he'll ever be warm again. It's a strange, suspended moment in history, a time when the environment completely rewrote the rules of human life. It reminds us that for all our monuments and our laws, we are ultimately just guests on a planet that can turn the locks on us whenever it feels like it. So, as you feel the warmth of your own room, let the image of the frozen Thames settle in your mind. Imagine the white expanse of the river, the flickering torches of the ice tents, and the absolute crushing silence of a world held in a grip of iron frost. The ice is thick, the air is still, and there is nowhere else to be. Just drift with the cold. Let the slow, frozen heartbeat of the 15th century lead you into a deeper, quieter rest. The river isn't moving, and for tonight, neither are you.
The herrings reign and the long shadow of Lent. So, the ice on the Thames has finally begun to groan and crack, sending those house-sized shards of frozen river downstream to batter the piers of London Bridge. The frost fair is over, the tents have been folded away, and the Lord of Misrule is now just a servant again, probably scrubbing the very floors he was dancing on 2 weeks ago. But just as the world starts to soften, just as the mud begins to reclaim the roads, we hit the most somber, most dietary challenged period of the medieval calendar, the arrival of Lent. If you thought the goose grease and onion phase was rough, welcome to the 40 days of the great salted herring. Now, we have to talk about the fish. In the medieval world, Lent wasn't just a suggestion, it was a legal requirement. Meat was strictly off the table. No beef, no pork, no poultry, not even butter or eggs. For a people who essentially lived on bacon and lard to survive the winter, this was a psychological and physical blow. And because this was the 1400s and they lived on an island, the answer to what do we eat now was always, inevitably, fish, specifically the herring. Imagine the royal kitchens now. The smell of roasting boar is gone, replaced by a pervasive, oily, and somewhat aggressive scent of dried fish. If you were a king, you might get fancy fish like salmon or sturgeon, but for everyone else, it was the humble, salted herring. It was so central to life that people actually wrote poems about it. They called it King Herring, but it was a king nobody really liked. By the third week of Lent, the snark in the Great Hall would be reaching a fever pitch. You'd have knights, men who were trained to fight in 60 pounds of steel, sitting around a table looking at a plate of gray, salty fish and probably contemplating a rebellion just for a single slice of cheese. But the medieval church was clever. They knew people were miserable, so they created a very specific ritual to transition from the carnival of winter into the fast of spring. This was Shrove Tuesday, what we now call Pancake Day. In the medieval mind, this was the great clean-out. You had to use up all your eggs, milk, and fat before midnight, or they would go bad during the 40 days of fasting. So everyone just cooked.
They made pancakes, they made fritters, they ate until they were physically uncomfortable. It was a frantic, greasy goodbye to joy. And then came Ash Wednesday. The party was over. The color was literally drained from the world. In the churches, the bright tapestries and golden crosses were covered with purple or gray cloths. Even the music changed. The upbeat lutes were replaced by solemn, monophonic chanting. The mood of the medieval winter shifted from fear of monsters to guilt about existing. For the royals, Lent was a time of public performance. A king had to show he was the most pious person in the room. This often involved the washing of the feet. The king would find a group of poor men, bring them into the palace, and personally wash their feet to imitate Christ. Now imagine being a medieval king. You believe your blood is literally better than everyone else's. You spend your days hunting and signing death warrants. And then, once a year, you have to get on your knees and touch the feet of a man who hasn't seen a bathtub since the previous rain. The snarky asides from the court jesters must have been legendary, though probably whispered very, very quietly. But back to the food, because it really did dominate everything. Because they couldn't have milk, they made almond milk. They would grind up almonds into a paste and mix it with water. It was the original dairy alternative, 600 years before it became a trend in modern coffee shops. They would use it to make fish custards and almond butter. It was an era of culinary deception. They were trying so hard to make fish taste like meat that they'd shape chopped up eel into the shape of a ham and color it with saffron to make it look fatty. It was a desperate, hungry kind of creativity. In the nurseries, the royal children were likely even more miserable. No eggs meant no treats, no meat meant no strength, or so the physicians thought. The children would be given Lenten figs and raisins to keep them going, but by the middle of March, everyone was salt sick. Their skin would get dry, their tempers would get short, and the dark, drafty corners of the castle felt less like a home and more like a waiting room for a spring that refused to arrive. There was also a strange folklore associated with the end of winter. They had a battle between Carnival and Lent. People would actually put on a play where a fat man riding a beer barrel, Carnival, fought a thin, pale woman riding a fish cart. Lent always won, of course. It was a way of telling themselves that the hunger was necessary, that the discipline of the fish was what made the eventual return of the sun so sweet. As we reached the middle of Lent, we hit Laetae Sunday, a tiny break in the gloom where you were allowed to relax the rules slightly. It was like a cheat day for the entire continent. People would visit their mother church, the place they were baptized, which led to the tradition of Mothering Sunday. They'd bring small gifts, perhaps a few flowers that had dared to poke through the mud, and for 24 hours the smell of the herring was replaced by the scent of baking bread. But then the purple cloths went back over the altars. The fast resumed. The world stayed gray. As you settle into your blankets, think about that long, slow crawl toward the light. Imagine the quiet of a monastery at midnight, the smell of beeswax and cold stone, and the distant rhythmic sound of the monks chanting for the sins of a world that was currently dreaming of bacon. The medieval winter didn't end with a bang. It faded out in series of hungry, quiet weeks. The ice has melted, the rivers are flowing again, but the ground is still too wet to plant. It's a time of waiting, a time of holding your breath. The king herring still rules the table, but the sun is staying up just a few minutes longer each day. Let the image of the gray-plaid monks and the salt-stained kitchens fade away. You don't have to fast. You don't have to wash anyone's feet. You just have to exist in the warmth and the quiet. The long fast is almost over. The winter is retreating into the shadows of history, and the morning is coming, eventually. For now, there is only the peace of the shadows and the steady, calm drift into the deep, dark spring.